we have a way of creating really big messes. I don't know if you've ever found yourself in the middle of a mess that you looked at, and the initial temptation ever since the garden is to start pointing fingers and say, well, if this person hadn't done that, or if this person had done what they were supposed to do. And yet sometimes things get so bad that we just have to admit, this is my fault. I've screwed things up. I've made mistakes. And often we make decisions that at times seem practical, that they seem well-intentioned. In fact, perhaps they even seem wise. And yet they're not. They're actually selfish and foolish and ultimately harmful. And this is a story that we're going to see played out in the life of Abraham in Genesis 16. And so as we come to this lesson, we're going to be talking about God's grace in our self-made disasters. And the way I break down this lesson, we start off by looking at the self-made disaster, and then we look at God's grace. And so that's going to be kind of the way that we break this down. We're going to watch as things just slowly start spiraling out of control for everyone involved in this story. And then we're going to see God step in a really big way and bring peace and harmony and resolution. So, as you get started, it's probably not a bad idea to ask your group, what are some ideas that we have that seem really good to us in the moment? And, we look back and realize that probably, that certainly was. That was unwise. That was unhelpful. So, as we come to this, we begin by looking at the disaster. And remember, in our previous two lessons, we were in Genesis 15. And there, God had said, you're going to have an offspring, and they are going to inherit this land. And he confirmed it with the stars and with a covenant. And he said, you're going to have lots of descendants. They're going to have the land. Lots of descendants have the land, I promise. Well, we come to Genesis 16, and Abram still doesn't have any descendants, which would seem to be a problem, right? God was very clear this was going to happen, and it's not happening. And it would seem that it can't happen because Sarah is at the age where she's too old. She's not able to have children. And so what happens is Abram and Sarai take matters into their own hands, and they decide, well, you know what? I think we can figure this out. And so what we're going to see in this whole thing is everybody's fault. So there's going to be three characters, right? We've got Abram, we've got Sarai, and we've got Hagar. And what we're going to see in each of them is that there are mistakes that are made that lead to this absolute catastrophe. Sarai is going to begin with worldly wisdom. Hagar is going to make things worse with proud conflict. And then finally, Abram is going to be the unfortunate cherry on top that really sets this all off with passive leadership. And so we'll look at each of those individually. Nobody's faultless here. Everybody has somewhat to blame. And so we begin with Sarai and with her understanding. So we read in chapter 16, verse 1, that Sarai, Abram's wife, bare him no children. But she has an handmaid, an Egyptian, whose name was Hagar. And Sarai said unto Abram, behold, now the Lord hath restrained me from bearing. I pray thee, go in unto my maid. It may be that I may obtain children to her. And Abram hearkened to the voice of his wife Sarai. And Sarai, Abram's wife, took Hagar, her maid, the Egyptian, after Abram had dwelt 10 years in the land of Canaan, and gave her to her husband Abram to be his wife. Okay, and so Hagar comes in, probably not as like a full-fledged wife, but the word here is his woman, probably a concubine, right? So second tier, somewhat of a relationship, but not his full-fledged, this is my wife Hagar, probably a concubine. Now, let's look at what Sarai did here. To us, this seems unthinkable, right? From a modern Christian sexual ethic, we look at the idea of a wife bringing another woman into the relationship. And to us, that seems bizarre. That seems incredibly out there. That seems foolish. And it was. But this was something that happened commonly during the time. And part of it is we have to get into the mindset of an ancient person. Again, we've already seen this with Abram. There's a strong desire. I want to pass on everything that I've accrued to my son. That was a very, very strong impulse. It was almost as if you lived a successful life and you had no descendants, then your name dies out and your honor dies out, and that's the end of you. You die not just physically, but you die socially as well. And the social death was almost worse to them than the physical death. And so there's this very strong push of, I want to have children. And nobody felt that more intensely than the wife. And sometimes the wife was not able to have children. And so it wasn't uncommon. In fact, we read about this happening in other cultures where wives would come to their husbands and say, here's a servant. What if we make her a surrogate, to use modern language? Obviously, there's not the genetic that we have today where we're going to take the sperm and the egg, but it's that same general concept of you have a child with her and it will count as my child. This makes sense to the world, but it's a lack of faith. Now, they've been in the land 10 years. We don't know when exactly Genesis 15 took place. It's probably after a while. I mean, Lot and Abram have separated. Lot's gone down to Sodom. Sodom's been conquered. Abram's rescued Lot. So was it 5 years in? Was it 6 years in? Was it 8 years in? We don't know. But they've been in the land for 10 years since God has promised, you are going to have a child. And then in Genesis 15, he doubles down on that promise. And so Sarai goes looking for solutions. And we have to be really careful when we start looking for solutions without asking God for guidance. We don't read about God at all in the first part of this chapter. This is what makes sense to Sarai, Abram, and Sarah and Hagar. They're all just living by what makes sense to them, and what makes sense to them is a disaster. And so I think that's an important warning for us that we want to be really, really careful that we don't just follow the thinking of the world around us. Ideas that make sense in our culture, in our particular moment in time, but ideas which maybe 1,000 years from now or even 1,000 years ago, people would have looked at it from outside of our culture and said, that's a really, really bad idea. It's easy to point the finger at Sarai and say, man, this is a ridiculous plan that you came up with. But we follow similar ridiculous plans if they make sense to people around us. So we'll go on and we'll look next at Hagar's part in this. And that's in verse 4. It says, and he went in unto Hagar, and she conceived, and when she saw that she had conceived, her mistress was despised in her eyes. Okay, so that's language we kind of need to break down to understand, to make sure we understand what this verse is saying. When she saw that she had conceived, when Hagar saw that she was pregnant, it says her mistress, that would be Sarai, her master. Okay, mistress is the feminine of master, so her master, her mistress, it says was despised in her eyes. She looked down on Sarai. And I mean, this is just all too human, right? You can see this where Sarai says, Hagar, why is the laundry not done? And Hagar says, well, I am pregnant. Sarai says, Hagar, I need you to help me with the cleaning. Can you please run this? And Hagar says, I don't know that I can. I am, after all, the one who's about to give birth to the heir. And Hagar just starts essentially ignoring her responsibilities. She looks down on Sarai. She's probably filled with some kind of a jealousy. You can imagine from Hagar's perspective, here she's the one who produces the offspring that her master so desperately wants, and yet Sarai's the wife. Shouldn't she be the wife? And after all, what's Sarai going to do? I mean, she's got the heir. I mean, Hagar looks at it and is like, this situation is going my way. I can kind of get away with doing what I want. Proverbs 30, verse 21 through 23 seems to be referring to this exact situation. It would seem that Sarai and Hagar are probably not the only instance of this. It says in Proverbs 20:21, it says, for 3 things the earth is disquieted, and for 4 which it cannot bear. For a servant when he reigns, okay, so if a servant becomes a king, that's a problem. And a fool when he is filled with meat, okay, somebody who's just completely rejected God's wisdom and life's going his way. That's obnoxious. For an odious woman when she is married, okay, you got somebody who's just a piece of work and she gets married, you're like, okay, that's obnoxious. And an handmaid that is heir to her mistress. And this seems to be this idea. You have the servant girl who's producing the heir on behalf of the mistress. And if you think about an obnoxious woman getting married, if you think about a servant who suddenly becomes a king, if you think about a fool who suddenly is living a successful life, all of these are just people that you look at and have the potential, at least, to be very, very obnoxious. And so that seems to be what's going on here. And again, this is very human. From a human standpoint, again, we could see this coming a mile away. And that leads to the third problem. And the third problem would be Abram's passive leadership. It says, as we look here, notice what the Bible says about this whole description. First, We're going to read verse 2. It says, And Sarai said unto Abram, Behold, now the Lord hath restrained me from hearing. I pray thee, go in unto my maid. It may be that I may obtain children to her. And Abram hearkened to the voice of Sarah. Now, if you've read your Bible carefully, that should sound familiar. Hearkened to the voice of. Hearkened to the voice of. Because if we were to go back to Genesis 3, we would read that Adam hearkened to the voice of his wife. Now, I want to be careful here. Obviously, I'm stepping on some delicate ground. This does not mean that husbands should not listen to their wife's counsel. I listen to my wife's counsel a lot, and she has lots of good things, and I'm very thankful for that. So I'm not saying, obviously, husbands should never listen to their wives. But in both of these instances, the point is that these wives in these circumstances were giving terrible advice. We're following the wisdom of the world. We're rejecting God's laws in the case of Eve. And the point is that in these instances, Adam and Abram should have stood up, and they should have led. And there are times when husbands need to stand up and lead and say, you know what? I don't think that's what we ought to be doing. And yet Abram doesn't do that. He sits back and he says essentially to his wife, oh, okay, I guess that sounds like a good idea. But Abram has also contributed to this problem in other ways as well. First of all, when we think about this story, we realize that we're talking about an Egyptian, right? Hagar the Egyptian. And the Bible makes it clear that she's an Egyptian, she's an Egyptian, she's an Egyptian. Question, where did Abram likely pick up an Egyptian slave? Well, probably in Egypt. Okay, so Abram goes down to Egypt, again, not asking God for his counsel. Abram teaches his wife through that whole trip, look, honey, preserving the family is more important than our relationship. Right? Preserving our life, that matters more. His priorities are all out of whack. They pick up this Egyptian slave as a result. And so Abram's foolish, sinful decisions, it's like he planted a seed. And remember, when we went through that lesson, we came out the other side and it was like, man, it almost seems like Abram got away with it, that things are going well. But if we read the story carefully, we're going to realize that Lot is going to go to Sodom because it's well-watered like Egypt. We're going to read that Sarai is going to take her Egyptian servant and give the servant to Abram as a concubine. And what we're seeing here is that the sinful choice that Abram made previously, it was like he planted a seed, and that seed is continuing to grow rotten fruit in his life. Galatians says this, doesn't it? It says, whatsoever man soweth, of that shall he also reap. So there's an important lesson there. Don't think that just because you immediately get away with something, that that's it. Sometimes when we make those sinful choices, it can bear rotten fruit in our lives repeatedly over a long period of time. And so Abram here is showing passive leadership. His wife comes to him in verse 5 after she's made these mistakes, after they've both made the mistakes, and she says to Abram, my wrong be upon thee. In other words, my mistake is your fault. Once again, we're not very good at accepting responsibility, are we? I have given my maid into thy bosom, and when she saw that she had conceived, I was despised in her eyes. The Lord judge between me and thee. And Abram said unto Sarai, behold, thy maid is in thy hand, do to her as it pleaseth thee. And when Sarah had dealt hardly with her, she fled from her face. Okay, so this is a disaster. We have this poor woman who's running for her life in the desert with Abram's son, and this whole thing could not have gone worse. And this whole time, we've not read anything about God. Sarah's got her plans, and Hagar's doing what she's doing, and Abram's just kind of sitting back and letting it happen, and God doesn't show up at all. Now we find that God shows up. It says in verse 7, and the angel of the Lord found her. What a beautiful picture. And you know, the fact that the Bible felt like it was worth it to take the time to explain this whole story about Hagar is really, really important because it shows us God's heart and compassion for everyone. Here's a runaway slave, and God's out in the desert looking for her. And so we read that God finds Hagar. Hagar is the last person you would expect the Bible to tell a story about, especially a positive story about God looking for her. After all, she is a foreigner. She's an Egyptian. She's a woman, which had less respect in these patriarchal times. And she's going to give birth to one of Isaac's rivals. But the story pauses and zooms in on her and wants us to know that even this woman, that for every other reason we might say she doesn't really matter for the story, she matters to God. And that's important because we all matter to God. Everybody's story is important to God. And so we see that God shows up and begins asking questions. And she says, I'm fleeing from my servant. And then we read God's encouragement to her. There's some interesting wordplay going on here. He tells her to go. We read that Sarah dealt hardly with Hagar. That's chapter 16 and verse 6. And this word, anah, could also be translated as oppress or humble. And yet in verse 9, she is told, return thyself to thy mistress and submit. That's anah again. Humble yourself before her. In other words, God is telling Hagar to take the path of humility and go back and listen to Sarai rather than trying to act like Sarai's equal. This is very different from the language that we hear today, right? Stand up for yourself, defend your rights. God here tells this servant woman, I want you to go back and I want you to listen to your mistress. And he doesn't just say, hey, go back. What are you doing out here? He actually gives her a promise. She is going to have many descendants. Verse 10, and the angel of the Lord said unto her, I will multiply thy seed exceedingly, that it shall not be numbered for multitude. And the angel of the Lord said unto her, behold, thou art with child, and shalt bear a son, and shalt call his name Ishmael, because the Lord hath heard thy affliction. Ishmael means the Lord hears. It's a beautiful picture here. And what we're going to see is that Hagar then praises God, and she gives him a name. She calls him El Roi, or as it's translated, thou God seest me. She called the name of the place that the Lord spake unto her, thou God seest me. For she said, have I also here looked after him that seeth me? Wherefore the well that she found was called Bir Lahai Roi, okay, which Bir is the Hebrew word for well, so the well of seeing. And Hagar goes back and she bears the son for Abram. It's interesting, there's, again, these two depictions of God here. These two important names, El Roi, the God who sees, and Ishmael, God hears. And so here you have this woman in the desert, because of the sinful choices of herself and many other people, just a complete mess, and God steps in because he sees and he hears. What a tremendous, comforting reality that even in the messes of our lives, God sees and God hears, and God is moved with compassion. God doesn't give up on us. God doesn't give up on his plan, but he steps back in with his grace, and he helps us in our self-made disasters. Trust this study has been a help to you, has been an encouragement to you, and I look forward to continuing the study, and we'll see you next time. Thanks.